in 2017, the year that I was doing that job, we had 5 terrorist attacks, 36 innocent people are murdered, including 2 police officers. And I think it's over 1,000 people were physically or mentally scarred for life.
The words of Neil Basu, former Assistant Commissioner of the Met Police, talking about his life in counter-terror, working closely with MI5 to stop terrorists attacking Britain. Neil quotes Dickens when he describes those 7 years as being the best of times and the worst of times. He worked on 12 terrorist attacks, including the horrific Manchester Arena bombing, and helped foil 29 plots that thankfully we'll never hear about. In part 2 of our Convex conversation, Neil shares more stories from his new book, Turmoil, which documents his 30-year career, including his time as a career detective in murder, organised crime and anti-corruption, and in the Ghost Squad, exposing seriously corrupt police officers. We also chat about Neil's heroes in life, his Indian-born dad, who was a doctor all of his life, and his Welsh mum, a nurse, both of whom he believes were pioneers at a time when mixed-race marriages were uncommon. We pick up with me asking about an hour-and-a-half in-depth interview that Neil did with The Guardian newspaper in 2019. Boris Johnson had been Prime Minister for just a few months, and they asked you a question, didn't they, right at the end? I think it was after Boris Johnson compared women in kneecaps to postboxes and used the phrase pickaninnies. Ridiculous stuff. Tell us about that interview. I think it really highlights what you also had to deal with some members of the press and perhaps taking things a little out of context or...
So Vikram, if you're listening, I don't blame you, I promise you. So Vikram Dodd was the crime correspondent at The Guardian. He was interviewing me at the time. By this time, I'm Assistant Commissioner Specialist Operations, so I'm the National Head of Counter-Terrorism. I'm doing an introductory interview talking about counter-terrorism and our strategy and my fears for the future and what I need the public to do to help us. And if you read the article in The Guardian, it was in 2019, I can't remember the exact date. It's a very good article. You know, he interviewed me for an hour and a half. The Commissioner's press officer was in the meeting with me because my own from counter-terrorism was on leave. And she said, why are you doing this interview? And I said, well, I want to get over what I plan to achieve in this job. You know, don't do this interview. It's a risk. And I said, no, it's not a risk. I know Vikram. He's never misquoted me. I think he's fine because he's from The Guardian. Policing is not naturally a Guardian reading public. So I think there's always a bit of nervousness around The Guardian. I had no problem with Vikram at all. It's a very good interview. If you read it today and read it, it's a very straight interview. It's exactly as I said it.
Why does nobody remember what you said in that article?
90 minutes in, and right at the end, he's about to switch off the tape recorder. He says, just one last question. Would you give somebody a job who used these expressions? And then he repeated the expressions that Boris Johnson had used. And I knew, and my press officer could see that I was, and she's like begging me not to answer this question. And I went, no, of course I wouldn't. That's all I said. So that goes in the interview, in the last bit of the interview. And it wasn't The Guardian who ran the headline. It was Lizzie Dearden in The Independent, whose editor wrote the press line, Basu wouldn't give Boris a job, which was not the answer to the question, but made a great headline for him and wasn't the purpose of the article at all.
It was also probably the truth. You wouldn't have given him a job as a police officer.
And now I've briefed him in counter-terrorism as a Prime Minister. I definitely wouldn't give him a job as a police officer.
Would you not?
So, no. I don't need to expand because the world has seen what he was as a Prime Minister and what he became. So I don't need to expand on that at all. But a lot of my friends would say, including Mark Rowley, said, you would be commissioned now if you had just not answered that question. And I said, how could any Chief Constable answer that question in any way other than no?
That was the only thing you could say because it was the truth.
Well, even if it wasn't about Boris, you know, if I had someone who presented themselves in interview to me as a police officer and was using those expressions, the interview would last about 10 seconds. And that should be the same for every Chief Constable, I hope. It goes back to our earlier conversation is you get to the top because you think you can do something about it. If you compromise your principles all the way just to get to the top, thinking that when you get there you can say things, then by the time you get there, you're not going to want to say them. This isn't a hindsight thing. I knew when I said it, it was potentially career defining. I didn't think it would be career ending, in all fairness. Still thought I had a good career ahead of me. But at that point, I knew this could be difficult. But if I don't say it as the most senior person of colour in policing in the country, who is ever going to say it?
But also, if you hadn't, what would the other headline have been?
I don't know.
I
think Lark and other people were trying to say, you could have spun it in some way, shape or form.
I think that was very difficult.
I think after 90 minutes, I've had years to think about it since, and because of the consequence of, Boris knew who I was long before then. He knew me when I was Paul Stevenson's staff officer as a youngish superintendent. So it's not like he didn't know me. Whether he'd taken that personally or not, I don't know. But I'm absolutely positive young spads around him will have taken it personally and would have said to him, you don't want that guy in charge.
Tell me a bit about your years in counter-terrorism. I think you said earlier they were probably the best years in policing.
So I'm going to quote Dickens and say they were the best of times and the worst of times, I think. And that's probably a really good way of putting it. The best because, I considered myself a career detective. I'd made my name as a detective in anti-corruption, in murder, in organised crime. I never thought you could be a detective until you'd spent some time in counter-terrorism. And of course, it'd been 23 years and I hadn't managed to get into the department. It really is an old boys network.
Is it?
Yeah. And it was very, very difficult to get into then. Less so now, much less so now, thank goodness. So I was a Deputy Assistant Commissioner by the time I got into counter-terrorism. And I remember Joshua, one of my sons, saying to me, Deputy and Assistant in one job title, Dad. You used to be a commander. That was cool. And Nina, she just looked at me. I was turning to Nina for support, thinking my younger son's just crushed me here because I thought I was a big shot and just been promoted. She said, you're a deputy assistant to an assistant to a deputy. And if you don't know the ranks in the Met, let me just say that's true. There's an assistant commissioner above you, which I later became. There's a deputy commissioner and there's a commissioner. So you are, and so
the title sort of makes sense.
The title sort of makes sense. And then when I eventually got to assistant, Josh said, still an assistant. So, and I retired as an assistant.
Well, your feet are still on the ground, Neil. Your kid never let you get your feet above the ground.
I tell that story a lot, and I tell it because it is a lesson in humility. You think you've become a big shot. But as a career detective, it was the honour of my life to be allowed to be part of the counter-terrorism effort in this country. I did the 3 most senior jobs in counter-terrorism policing consecutively through probably the highest level of threat since the Troubles in Northern Ireland and back in the 70s. So I'm very proud of what we achieved. By the time I left, the threat level to the UK was lowered. Myself and Ken McCallum, the current head of MI5, we're both very proud of that fact. It's still very high volume and tempo, but I dealt with 12 terrorist attacks and 29 foiled plots. So the teams who worked for me did amazing things. And the reason it was the best of times was, A, as a career detective, that's an amazing thing to do, but also you are surrounded by some of the very best detectives in the country. Well, in 9 regional counter-terrorism units working alongside our great partner MI5. And when I got the job of being in charge of operations, my job with MI5, the job description runs to 4 pages, but I can do it in 1 line, which is work with MI5 and stop terrorists attacking us. And of course, in 2017, the year that I was doing that job, we had 5 terrorist attacks, 36 innocent people are murdered, including 2 police officers, and I think it's over 1,000 people were physically or mentally scarred for life. And that weighs heavy on your soul, so this is kind of the worst of times. Every time an attack gets through, you think of it as an intelligence failure. We talked earlier on about holding the mirror up. You immediately think, what have I done wrong? What could I have done to prevent this? I'm not the only person who feels like that at the top of the organisation. Everyone from the most junior person in the organisation to the top feels, what on earth happened? Theresa May took my boss, Mark Rowley at the time, to one side along with Andrew Parker, Ken McCallum's boss, and said, you need to stop this momentum now, after Manchester Arena. You need to stop these attacks. It's the most arrests, I think it was 465 in a 12-month period. It's never happened before or since in counter-terrorism. Effectively trying to suppress the volume of plotting against this country and murder that was going on at the time. It was extraordinary. And at the same time, we did a review of everything we did in counter-terrorism alongside MI5, and we came up with 104 ways that we could be better at our day job. That is an incredibly humbling moment. This is properly humbling. We'd been going around the world saying to the world, the United Kingdom has the best counter-terrorism machine in the world. The government, the intelligence agencies and police working together, no one has anything like it. And by the way, they don't. And it's still probably the leading model in the world. But 104 ways to be better. And that was what I meant by the best of times and the worst of times. I described that to Yvette Cooper when she was chairing the Home Affairs Select Committee as trying to fine-tune a Formula One car while it's still going around the track setting lap records. That was the volume we were dealing with. And at the same time, we were trying to fix ourselves. It was quite something.
What are you most proud of from that period?
I'm proud of that. I'm proud of the fact that, despite the fact that we were working at such a high threshold, 29 foiled plots is something. We never talk about those.
Of course, the foiled plots we don't hear about. We sleep easy on our bed at night when you foiled attacks, but we don't read about this.
Lovely Lizzie did write a book about it called Plotters, but unfortunately she's quite disparaging about counter-terrorism policing. She said it was more luck than judgment. Well, some of it was judgment, Lizzie. So you are quite proud of those, but at the time you never thought of those. You thought of the 12 attacks that got through and the people who were killed and injured, And I remember walking into the major incident room in Manchester that Simon Barraclough, the brilliant senior investigating officer, was running his incident room. And I'd walked in there a couple of days after Amber Rudd had been there. And we both did the same thing, which was we both burst into tears, but I didn't let my people see that I had. They were telling me Amber had done it, and I was standing behind them crying. They had the pictures of every person who'd been murdered around the walls of the incident room to remind their people that when they turned up for work every morning, this is what they were doing it for. And of course, it was nearly 3 years later that we convicted the bomber's brother at the Old Bailey, and that's the longest sentence in British criminal history. And I'm proud of that as well. We extradited him from Libya, a country that has no extradition treaty with the UK, in the middle of a civil war, from the hands of the militia into the Old Bailey, and convicted him for 55 years. And we should be proud of that. But it's very hard to be proud of that when you're looking at a wall with 22 murdered people, one of whom is 8 years old. And it's very, very hard.
How do you cope with things like that?
Jenny Jones. She's one should look her up.
I think it's great that you've been to see Jenny Jones.
The stigma around mental health is a big thing. So in my final year, we held a mental health awareness day for SO15, the largest counter-terrorist command in the country. It's the London Counter-Terrorism Command. It has about 2,500 people in it, and over 500 people turned up. Considering mental health has been a stigma in policing for as long as I've been a police officer, the fact that 500 people turned up to that event tells you something about how people had suffered during this period of very high threat. One of the teams that was there was the team that was coming back from the Sri Lankan Easter Day bombings. They were the worst briefings I've ever had in my career. The graphic nature of those briefings, they were awful. And I met this young team. They were headed by a 40-year serving counter-terrorism detective sergeant whose first case had been the Hyde Park bombings in 1977. And he was sitting with his colleagues, and the person who opened the conference for me was Prince Harry. I'm probably Harry's greatest supporter because of this day. His equerry said, it's 2 minutes and then he's got to go. And my head of protection said, but he's happy to come and say hello to the team that's just come back from Sri Lanka. He spent 45 minutes with them. And when he left, that 40-year serving sergeant had tears in his eyes because Harry understood. And I thought it was the most amazing human thing I had seen. And I talked to all of these people about how necessary it was to talk about trauma and to find somebody professional. You don't have to talk to the world about it. You don't have to write a book. You don't have to write a book.
To tell everybody.
You don't have to tell everybody. You have to tell. Jenny used to joke with me and said, my God, I can't cure you before you finish the book. Otherwise the book will be really boring. So she didn't mean that. But the point is, you need to talk to somebody about it. And he understood. He's a combat veteran. But he stayed 40 minutes longer than he should have been there just to let these people tell them their stories. And people haven't seen that side of him. No. I have. It was quite a moment, and I guarantee everyone in that room would have walked on hot coals for him when he left that room. It was quite something to see.
Well, in fact, William, Kate and Harry in the old days, made a very dynamic team when they came forward to talk about mental health.
I genuinely think that the four of them acting together when they did that broke a big barrier in policing, and probably I have young sons. So people were much more open in talking about mental health and the problems in all walks of life. I know a lot about it in policing, and I know a lot of very damaged people in policing. I think one of the surveys we did back in 2018, a fifth of police officers showed signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. A fifth, 1 in 5. That's from a response rate of 13,000 police officers. So it's not a small statistical sample. No. It's not like polling.
I like the phrase you use, you're a career detective, and you said growing up you liked all the shows I liked, Columbo and Inspector Morse and all those kinds of crime-solving things, but you've dealt with some difficult, grisly, dreadful things in your time. But what did you love most about becoming a career detective?
It's actually a much easier thing to answer than you might imagine, because If you put all of that trauma to one side, your job, you are absolutely there for the victim. Every murder squad senior investigating officer will tell you this. My favourite job was DCI on Trident, solving unsolvable murders in gangland London back in the late 90s and early noughties. And you are working for people who are literally at the worst point of their lives. This is why the Lawrence story, Dorian and Neville, is so important to me, because I've heard mothers wailing for their children. I have hugged mums at the graveside of their sons who have been murdered in cold blood on the streets of London, and we have put those killers away. And I don't think you ever get any closure as a bereaved parent, but the closest you're ever going to get is some sense of justice, and that's what you bring to the party. That is your sole job. To be frank, you can do that for the victims of a bike theft or a phone theft, or I went on to deal with anti-corruption, murder, all the most serious offences you can think of. But it does start with understanding that everyone who has been traumatised by a crime, no matter how trivial, deserves that kind of approach. That's what you're most proud of, that you help people who are very vulnerable, often at the worst time of their lives. My dad used to say to me, he was misquoting Gandhi, but I didn't know it was a misquote at the time, and I prefer my dad's. He used to say, there's no higher calling than to lose yourself in the service of others. My dad was a brilliant doctor, as you could tell by the number of people who were at his funeral. That quote has stuck with me my whole life, and I became a cop because I wasn't bright enough to be a doctor. My elder brother was, he's a genius, but I wasn't, because that would be my way of giving some kind of public service back after a few years spent wasting my time in the private sector and pursuing that horrible demon money.
You were in banking, weren't you? And I think I had a quote somewhere, which I now can't... Oh, I hated every single minute of it. I realised it was full of greedy, corrupt people doing useless, valueless jobs. That was your assessment of your years in the city of banking.
I have a number of very close friends who are bankers. I apologise.
Sorry about that.
I think they've read it.
Were you impressed that in my 25 pages of notes that I managed to pull that quote out?
I am, and for me it's the difference. And over the years, my friends who are very successful business people have said, look, there is some morality in business. We do employ thousands of people who can pay their mortgages because we employ them. I get all of that argument. That was not what I witnessed in the late 80s in banking. And I could have predicted the two banking crises that followed. And in fact, my final boss gave a speech in Brussels back in, I think it was 1990, which cost him his job, which was effectively banking is becoming ruinous because we are hiring salespeople, not bankers. And he was absolutely right. And every banking crisis that has happened since is because we hired salespeople, not bankers. He was a genius. His name was Jeff Mannering. He's probably not with us anymore. But he was an old-style banker, high values, was trying to create economic wealth and give people a job, not trying to make a fast buck selling people things that should not be sold to them.
It leads us nicely on to a little bit of growing up. Tell me a bit about Mum and Dad.
Well, they're my two great heroes, as you know, because you've read the book. So my mum was a nurse for 40 years, and my father was a doctor for nearly 50 years. He didn't retire till he was 76. He refused to retire because he became a general practitioner at the end of his career, but his great love was obstetrics and gynecology. He was going to be a specialist, but back in the 60s in this country, no one was going to give somebody in their early 30s a consultancy in OBGYN. He was effectively blackballed by what would then have been the equivalent today of Staffordshire Trust. There is a picture of him in black tie, an evening dinner with his mentor, and it's the night before my mother tells me he was going to be told that he was going to become a consultant, and therefore he'd be able to look after his family and he'd be well paid. It's still very hard as a hospital doctor who isn't a consultant to make ends meet if you have a growing family. And his mentor had a massive heart attack and died. And the next day, the committee effectively blackballed him. He never talked about that. I took that to the grave with him. I've only learned these things from my mother. He never complained a single day about racism in his life. Maybe I should have learned, but maybe he shouldn't have turned the other cheek quite so much. But Stafford District General Hospital, back in the days before it became a bit of a shameful mess, gave him an honorary consultancy job. So every Thursday he ran an OBGYN clinic in Stafford District General Hospital for decades. And when my eldest was born, unexpectedly we were visiting my parents in Stafford. My ex was rushed into hospital, and the next morning all of the consultants came in off the golf course and sat in their offices to make sure that Louise was okay. I went to get coffee, and as I walked to the coffee, my father was coming up, and all the nurses had lined up as a kind of guard of honour for my dad.
That's amazing.
And I'd never seen him. So anyway, he was quite a remarkable human being. but not as remarkable as my mother, who left North Wales, a tiny town of about 60 people, when she was 17 to go and become a nurse, met my father at Leamington Spa, fell in love with my dad and took my dad home to North Wales in the heart of Snowdonia, in the foothills literally underneath Snowdon, and showed North Wales what an Indian man looked like. They had never ever seen anyone of colour in their village when my mum took my dad home.
And what they didn't talk about is they didn't have it easy, did they, as a mixed-race couple? But no. I think from memory you said in the book that they didn't really talk about that.
They didn't talk about it. This was a very sad moment. At my mother's 80th birthday party, my brothers and I talked about what happened to us at school for the first time in our lives. When I went to high school, I was bullied, beaten up and shoved in a locker within 30 seconds of walking through the front door of the high school on my very first day as a high school student. It was quite something. I remember the name of the 3 boys who did it. I hope they remember mine now. I've got a much bigger gang now. The only other boy of colour at the school at the time was my eldest brother. And Kuma and I never spoke about this our whole lives until my mother's 80th birthday party. So Kuma was 56, I was 54. My younger brother, Ronnie, was 50 years old. And we were sitting there, drunk, having a conversation about what happened to us at school. And I thought they'd got away with it. And I was really wrong about that, of course. But it's my mother overheard us talking. And she was in the doorway crying, saying, I knew I shouldn't have married your father. We did discuss whether we should have children or not, because of how difficult it would be for you as mixed-race children. And now I think I must have made a mistake. And that was heartbreaking. I mean, she loved my father unconditionally for 50 years, nursed him in the final 12 months of his life when he couldn't move and couldn't speak, nearly hospitalised herself as a result of it. She loved him, and they were my great heroes, and she said that. And I said, Mum, you were pioneers. This is really important. This is why they're more heroic than they realise. In 1966, when they had my eldest brother, mixed-race marriages were not that common. They are very common today. They weren't that common then. It was unusual and it was difficult. When you look at the British Nationality Attitude Survey of 1982, the first year it was developed, 90% of the public would not live next door to somebody of colour. And we suffered that. We suffered neighbours saying horrible things about us growing up. I remember a little bit about that as a child. And my parents had to wear that. When they first moved into their house where my mother still lives, the neighbours came around and complained about the smell of curry. We didn't actually have a kitchen, because they were cooking baked beans on a camp stove because of the mortgage, but that's the kind of attitude at the time. Look at the British National Attitude Survey today. Despite everything we read and all the hyperbole in the press about immigration and reform and all the rest of it, and how we're sort of demonising and how we're lurching to the right, look at the British Nationality Attitude Survey. The tolerance in this country is phenomenal. It's the reason in the Western world, in a white majority culture, the United Kingdom is the only place I would want to live. And I've studied all of the others because my job was counter-extremism and counter-terrorism. So this is the one where I'd live. And that tolerance was developed because of pioneers like my parents.
Yeah, your parents really were pioneers. I don't think they wanted you to be a police officer, though, did they?
No, I think, well, what's quite funny is my mum thought I was too sensitive and I wouldn't like the sight of blood. And I said, well, I've seen...
As a nurse, she probably had a good feel for that as to whether you'd like the sight of blood.
Well, she did. Nobody should like the sight of blood. It's how I would respond to that. And yes, I've seen some very grisly things I wish I'd never seen. And the difficulty of this job is you can close your eyes and describe them all. So you either suffer from it long term but you never forget it. I don't care who you are. You never forget the things you've seen. And it is horrific. But that wasn't what they meant. They knew I was very thin-skinned. This sounds ironic because I've kept it to myself for so many years, but they knew I was very thin-skinned about racism because of what had happened to me. They didn't know what happened to me my first day in high school, but they did know other incidents. And my poor mother had watched, security guards try and turf me out of shops when I was shopping with her because they didn't realise I was with her, that kind of stuff. So she knew what we were going through as we got older, and she knew that I would sometimes react, quite badly to that. So my dad's view was he's too sensitive to be a cop because the first time they're racist to him, he'll punch someone's lights out and he'll end up in prison instead of patrolling the street. So I think he was very nervous about that. My dad's final contract as a general practitioner, the one he wouldn't give up until the day he retired, was his forensic medical examiner contract with Staffordshire Police. I really pity all the Staffordshire custody sergeants who've had to listen to my dad crowing about me as a cop. It's such a shame he never lived to see me get the Queen's Police Medal, but his proudest day of me was when I solved the Byfield murder back in 2005. I made a statement outside the Old Bailey, and ITV used it to open the news that night at 10 o'clock. And my dad hadn't realised that was going to happen, and he was a BBC watcher his whole life. But for some reason, the TV was on ITV.
Reminds us of the Byfield murder.
Well, this was not very far from here, Kensal Rise. Tony Byfield was a drug dealer, and his very innocent 7-year-old daughter, Tony Ann, was staying with him in a bedsit in Kensal Rise, not a mile or so away from here. Another drug dealer tried to rob him, shot him, and then shot Tony Ann as a witness. And it took us 2.5 years to track him down. Joel Smith, he's doing 40 years before he's eligible for parole. And it was seen as an unsolvable murder. We had no forensics, no witnesses, no CCTV. We had absolutely nothing. And solving that murder was the highlight of my detective career. It certainly put me on the map. I did become known as One Job Basu after that. So I did have a lot of other...
They always had nicknames, didn't they?
Yeah,
but it was a proud moment for your dad, switching on
and seeing that statement. So, and the greatest thing about that case was a family, just like the Lawrences, who had no faith in policing. The way we treated them, the family liaison that we put in place and we carried on for years until we solved the crime, made that family realise that some of us were really in it for the right reasons. That is, alongside counter-terrorism, that particular case is the proudest moment of my career.
Operation Trident, which you touched on briefly. Just tell us a bit more about that, because that was also a very proud time of your career, and I think you felt that policing had changed through Operation Trident. Again, for listeners who perhaps aren't familiar, just give us a reminder of what Operation Trident, what the aims were there.
Well, Operation Trident started in 1998, so it was the year before Macpherson reported that the Met was institutionally racist, and it was set up because of a vicious robbery gang that was basically marauding its way through South London, and they murdered a woman in front of her children called Avril Johnson. It was such a despicable crime, and they went on to commit some other despicable crimes, that a unit was set up, just a handful of officers were set up to track this group down, and they were known as Trident. And by 7 degrees of separation, I'm a young detective sergeant running the intelligence unit at Brixton, and one of my weekly jobs was to go and brief Steve Coopis, who was the DCI running Operation Trident, who was in a porter cabin in South London. By the mid-noughties, Trident was 450 officers strong in a big building in a posh part of South London with a lot of resource and a lot of capability. I think because of Macpherson, Steve Coopis was doing an amazing job tackling black-on-black crime. It was very clumsily called. The black community didn't really like that. But it was the black community who came forward and said, look, we don't like you very much, but we need your help because these people are ruining our communities. They're perverting our young boys who want to follow them into this gangland lifestyle. They are causing mayhem in our community. We are predominantly the victims of that. You need to help us. And the Metropolitan Police stood up, put money, put resource behind it. I set up the 3rd murder squad. They were so overrun by murders and attempted murders that they needed 2 new squads, and I set up the 3rd one, and a colleague of mine set up the 4th one in South London, and I ran a squad out of West London for 4 years. And it was the murder squads who got those murder convictions who gave the black community confidence that the Metropolitan Police was finally on its side. And there was an independent advisory group chaired by a brilliant woman called Cheryl Seeley, who advised us on how we should do our business. But for me, it's the best business case for understanding institutional racism and how to win back trust and confidence from a community who doesn't think you're on their side, was Operation Trident in the late 90s and early noughties.
Another interesting chapter. They were all interesting chapters. I should be your PR person, really.
There is a vacancy.
Is there a vacancy? I accept.
I think they dropped them.
And I like the name of this, The Ghost Squad. Catching Baddies with Badges. Now, that's quite a fun title, but actually that was serious business, wasn't it? Looking into corrupt cops. And I would imagine pretty heartbreaking at times to know that one of your own is doing pretty awful stuff.
Because of the work I'd done on the Lawrence inquiry for a brilliant detective called Bob Quick, who was my detective superintendent then, he went from the Lawrence inquiry to run the Ghost Squad, CIB3 as it was properly called, as the detective chief superintendent on promotion. And he wouldn't take me there originally because I was too young, too green, still a young detective sergeant. And the Ghost Squad was full of the most experienced, hand-picked detectives in London. So the senior officers who set it up because Paul Condon, who doesn't get enough credit for this in my view, set up an intelligence cell 5 years earlier to say, I think, like Robert Mark in the 70s, I think I've got a problem with corruption in the Metropolitan Police in the 90s. He came from Kent, came into the Met. Everyone who comes from outside the Met has a jaundiced view of the Met. But he was right. And he had a problem with there were around 200 or so corrupt police officers. This isn't corruption in terms of small-scale stuff like bribery. These are drug dealers and people conspiring to murder people. And by the time I got there, I had about 6 years' service. I was a detective inspector. I was brought in to run the surveillance. So as a surveillance DI, although the squad worked in cells, so you only knew the job you were working on, because it had to be so tight because they were scared of corrupt cops leaking information to the bad guys who were corrupting other cops and effectively ruining the jobs. But as the head of surveillance, you saw across the whole of the casework. So you saw just exactly how many cops there were and what they were doing. It was years after I left that I realised, well, actually, it's a very small number. We should actually be quite proud of the fact that it isn't a big number. But when you're young in service and you join thinking everybody joined for the right reasons, to do the right thing, help people who are vulnerable at the worst time in their lives, like I thought we were the good guys. And suddenly you're arresting people with badges who are very much the bad guys. That is a sobering moment. And I think every young police officer should work in professional standards early on in their careers to see what some of their colleagues are really capable of. And this is my problem with chief constables later on who don't have a zero tolerance attitude to corruption and prejudice. I think it's because they have these rose-tinted spectacles thinking, it wouldn't happen on my watch. These people aren't like that. Everyone joined like me to be a good person. It's just not true.
And that's not just a few. That's not just a few bad apples. 200 sounded a lot to me, and presumably corrupt officers, I would imagine, are very difficult to catch because they know the inner workings.
Don't forget there were 30,000 police officers in the Met at the time. So 200 is a big number.
Yeah.
And I don't shy away from the fact that that is an unacceptable number. And the point is, policing will always need a very well-equipped, very experienced and very capable professional standards department, whether you're in Cumbria or the Metropolitan Police. And we have not always taken that seriously. Paul Condon, as the Commissioner of the Met back in the 90s, deserves great credit for taking it seriously, as did Robert Mark before him in 1974. Operation Countryman it was called. If you want to Google that and understand what that was a very corrupt time in policing in the 70s. The early 90s wasn't great in the Met. And corruption has changed, and what Casey exposed was an attitude problem that we have. The prejudice, the bullying, the misogyny and the racism. And getting those people out was the number one priority of Mark Rowley when he became Commissioner in 2022, and he deserves great credit for that.
Were you shocked with the murder of Sarah Everard when obviously it was revealed that it was an off-duty policeman or an off-duty detective that had carried out that murder?
Yeah, that's the most egregious crime by a serving police officer in my history of 30 years at police. And I dealt with people who were planning to murder bad guys, as opposed to an innocent woman being kidnapped off the streets by a serving police officer using their authority at the time in order to commit that murder. Anybody who isn't shocked by that really probably needs looking at. As serving police officers, of course, we were shocked. By the way, the detective response was brilliant. I mean, catching Wayne Couzens, convicting him. Kat Goodwin was the SIO. She deserves to be called out. She was amazing. Every SIO has a job that almost breaks them. I imagine that was it for Kat. But they did a great job securing some kind of justice for the family of Sarah. I don't think we realised. We were too busy being shocked at the behaviour of one of our own colleagues. We forgot how shocked every woman and girl was in the country. I had friends whose wives have known me for... One of them, I introduced him to his wife. She's known me for 40 years. We're old friends. She wouldn't have opened the door to a detective after what happened to Sarah Everard, and she's known me for 40 years, 30 years of which I've been a police officer. Such was the trust and confidence gone from policing. We underestimated that hugely. And I think the vigil and the policing the vigil, which was a complete disaster, albeit complicated by COVID, albeit very difficult decision-making, albeit politically influenced. Whatever the excuses for it, that showed you the depth of feeling, the strength of feeling from women and girls. And everything that's happened since with the Violence Against Women and Girls programme, to me, after 30 years, feels a little bit too little too late. I mean, Ian Blair's just died, may he rest in peace. I worked in his staff offices alongside my wife. He doesn't get the credit he deserves for completely transforming rape investigation when he was a young detective. The fact that he was doing that in the 80s, why are we still trying to transform rape investigation in 2025 when we knew how to do it when I joined the police? It does seem that sometimes a crisis exposes us again and again and again. It's almost like we just don't learn.
You say there that we don't really learn It's now 2025. Your book details 30 years of your career. There have been repeated reports that levelled that racism was the Achilles heel of the Met Police. What's it like now? And has the Met learnt or not learnt enough?
I think the Met has learnt. I think Chief Constable's difficulty, including the current Commissioner, in admitting institutional racism, I think is a big Achilles heel. They underestimate how much the black community, particularly the young Afro-Caribbean black community, would want to hear that kind of understanding that they've had a problem and the contrition that comes with apologising for it. I think that would be a one-day wonder in the media, but would give them a platform to build back some of that trust and confidence in the future. I think lots of Chief Constables are doing quite a lot of good work trying to win back that trust and confidence, but without that platform, and that just making it harder for themselves. So that makes it hard for me to say we've learnt our lessons, but actually I feel very sorry for the current generation of police officers who are overwhelmed by work and over-scrutinised, not just by their bosses, who are very defensive about getting anything wrong and being exposed for getting anything wrong, but also by the public, who everyone is a citizen journalist with a camera now. So they are under scrutiny 24/7, and they're working under tremendous pressure. And yet we still have tens of thousands of them get up every day and go out and protect us. And they deserve all the credit. The trouble is they are working alongside some people who do not deserve to be carrying the badge. And the more those good police officers call out those bad police officers so they don't have to be found out by professional standards. In other words, you don't deserve to work alongside me. You don't deserve to serve the public because you don't deserve that badge. And my understanding is, particularly from the Met, is that reporting good officers having the courage to basically blow the whistle on bad police officers is improving. So I think the culture is improving. I think Mark's made a very good start in trying to transform professional standards in policing. I hope other Chief Constables are following him, because that's so important for the long-term health of policing in our eyes as citizens. My problem is also with the media, because we just don't report good policing. We just don't. I mean, that's the reason for my podcast. The balance of reporting in policing is whenever a police officer does something awful, either incompetent or horrific, that's front-page news. Whenever they do something good, you barely hear about it. It's almost like we don't exist unless somebody is killed or seriously injured in the line of duty, and then everyone remembers why we're there. Without policing, there would be utter chaos. It's probably the most important public service. You cannot enjoy anything about your life if you're not safe. A lot of us don't feel safe. The perception that the media have given of crime in this country is not the reality. It is not the reality, other than when you're online. When you're online, be very, very careful. But other than when you're online, almost every other metric has been going the right way for 25 years. There's a spike at the moment in shoplifting, cost of living crisis, and some organised crime involved. There's a spike at the moment in knife crime if you're young and in certain inner city areas. But this is not common. The way that we live our lives now, when I started in policing, it was a much more violent, difficult and dangerous time than it was when I left. And counter-terrorism as well. It's like if you're involved in a terrorist incident, it's like being hit by lightning. We need to get our sense of perspective back, and we need to get our sense of what policing is for and what it's actually doing back in perspective. And I think that requires a lot more effort.
And just a final thought, Neil. You said to me at the beginning when we had a cup of tea, you said that you thought I'd had a very interesting career. I think, I'm not even going to say you had a fantastic career, because I think this is just part of your career, because you're now going on to pastures new. But what do you miss most about being at the absolute heart of it? Because it's quite addictive, isn't it? The kind of work and helping people that you've done.
I definitely miss the conviction. So that's a terrible thing to say, but I'm not as woke as Boris and his ilk think. I got a big kick out of being at the Old Bailey and watching somebody get sent down for a very long time for being a very bad person. But I also remember that a lot of those people have a history. They weren't born bad, they were made bad by society. And having a voice in some of those rooms where you could start talking about the fact that this is a system that we have to put more money into it's not just about policing, they're just one small part of the system. I miss being able to have that kind of influence. I miss the people who work in counter-terrorism, particularly my colleagues in MI5. I wish the public knew more about them. I wish they knew how extraordinary they were and what they were doing every day to keep us safe alongside my old colleagues. I guess one of the things when I was young, I thought, when I grow up, I'd really like to be in the room. I'd like to know what's going on. I'd really like to understand how this country is run. My academic training is in economics, so I'm kind of looking at how the world is run is a kind of an important thing from when I was very young. And I miss being in the room when those decisions are made. But I did get to a point, depending on who was sitting around the table, there does come a point, particularly when you're older than most of the people sitting around that table and you realise they really don't have a clue. Sometimes it's nicer to be retired.
Yeah, well, you're retired. You're hosting the Crime Agents. I knew it would be an absolute treat to sit here. I feel like now we should go to the pub and have a glass of wine, quite frankly. I could seriously listen to you all
That's
day.
an old-fashioned coping mechanism for police officers, yes.
Are you still allowed to do that, the old-fashioned coping mechanism?
I think it's still alive and well. Good, as a cultural activity in police.
And anybody listening to this, you must get Neil's book, Turmoil, 30 Years of Policing, Politics and Prejudice. I say that as somebody who's actually going to read it again because there was so much detail in it, and I read it quite fast because I was reading it for our interview, but it's a cracking book and I'm really glad that you wrote it. It's an important read and it is an uncomfortable read at times, but I mean that in the nicest possible way. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen.
You've been listening to former Assistant Commissioner of the Met Police, Neil Basu, who retired as the most senior officer of colour in the country. His book Turmoil is an eye-opening and gripping read, and you can hear more of Neil on his new podcast, The Crime Agents. Download and subscribe to our series at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple or wherever you listen to yours. And if you like the podcast, then do leave us a review. I'll be back next week with the victim of attempted murder. Natalie Kairosh was stabbed 24 times when she was 8 months pregnant. Not only did she and her baby survive the frenzied attack with a carving knife, Natalie now works with gangs in the prevention of youth violence and champions victims for West Midlands Police. Don't miss her extraordinary story.